The aim of this panel is really twofold. We want to try and shed some light on the ways that civil society organisations in this country have responded to key recommendations by Lord Leveson relating to the basis or underpinning of the system of self-regulation of the press. And we also want to discuss, in the spirit of today's theme of transparency and accountability, the ways in which civil society organisations that are involved with media standards and with the rights and freedoms related to media and communications reach positions on what might be called matters of principle. Talking about Leveson with Damien and others at the Media Policy Project, Leveson, the Royal Charter and civil society disagreements about the Charter, it seemed to us that the picture of civil society responses to this fundamental issue, at a moment when that issue was, and perhaps is, clearly wide open to radical reform, was pretty confused and confusing. For my own part, I remember a certain sense of foreboding when I opened the Daily Mail just a day or two after Leveson's report was released to see key principles being denounced and disowned from within civil society. And almost before, as we used to say, the ink was dry on those recommendations. So I thought then we were in for a good deal of turbulence, and that's indeed proven to be the case. Now, since then, the disagreements, the takings of position, the unexpected alliances have multiplied and resounded. The fact of those disagreements and alliances and so forth, and indeed the fact of the impression of confusion that I just mentioned, may be a good thing, of course, a sign of healthy plurality in this segment of the civil society landscape. But even so, it seems worth just considering questions of accountability and representation. We know who and whose interests the press industry represents when it expresses itself about the Leveson proposals. We know whom MPs represent, likewise. But whom and what do civil society organisations represent? Who are they speaking for? To whom are they responsible? And how do they operationalise that responsibility? I should just say before moving on that my own organisation, the OSF, does not really have a dog in this ring. The OSF is a civil society organisation active on media freedom and media development, mainly through grant giving, and we do a bit in the UK, but we have not taken a position on these issues. We don't generally take positions of that kind. Now, we're very lucky to have two such well-qualified speakers to launch us on our way this morning. Thomas Hughes is the Executive Director of Article 19. He's got more than 15 years' experience working on press freedom, media development and human rights. He was Deputy Director of International Media Support, IMS, a very well-known Danish agency, for 5 years, and he's also worked in the intergovernmental sector for the European Commission and the LSE. David Aaronovitch is, as you know, a journalist, broadcaster and author. Currently a columnist for The Times. He's written for many papers over the years. He's won the Orwell Prize for journalism and been a columnist of the year for What the Papers Say. David is especially qualified for today's panel by his position as chair of Index on Censorship. So I've asked Tom and David to prepare a few opening remarks to get things started. Tom, can you please tell us about Article 19's position on the core Leveson proposal and how that position was reached? What do you think the disagreements among civil society organisations have been about? And what do you think their impact has been? I mean, the impact of CSOs on the wider debate about regulation of the press and the impact of the disagreements on that impact, so to speak. Finally, should CSOs be doing more to clarify mutually and reciprocally their positions of principle? And is there anything you think British CSOs should be learning and could apply from other countries in this respect?
Mark, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to LSE for the invitation. There is a small degree of irony, I guess, that academia has gathered together CSOs on a panel chaired by a private donor to talk about accountability and to have some transparency about the positions that we reach. And I think David and I, we might quite enjoy inviting academia back one day to having a similar panel to ask them about their own positions. Oh, I have one follower in the audience at least. But that's tongue-in-cheek. That's said just to provoke. It is a pleasure to be here, and it's a very important discussion. And I think, obviously, because of the differences in opinion that we see amongst civil society actors, it's an important one to be had. I'm not going to take it for granted that you all know who Article 19 is, so I will spend 60 seconds or less, hopefully, briefly describing who and what we are. Article 19 derives its name from Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We are an international human rights organization that specializes in freedom of expression and the right to information. We are UK-based, but spread around 9 offices internationally, and have been working for the last 30 years very much with a legal and policy-related focus in our work, engaging in international advocacy as well as regional and domestic advocacy as well around national legislation and policies and standard setting. So as that introduction or description of Article 19 would dictate, the position and our interpretations of both Leveson and the Royal Charter are very much based around international human rights standards and law. So what I'll do actually in my opening introductions is focus a little bit more on what we interpret that law to say, or what it does say, how we apply that to Leveson and the Royal Charter, some of the concerns that we have about Leveson and the Royal Charter, and then maybe very briefly a couple of words about the civil society positions around that. But then I hope that we would have a more fruitful discussion around those issues. I think those are the core ones for us to discuss here today. So where do we derive the Article 19 position from? Well, I'll tell you where we derive it from first and then come back to what that position actually is. But very broadly speaking, it's derived starting from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the ICCPR, the international treaties and the treaty bodies that interpret those treaties. So obviously very much based around the United Nations, but also regional bodies, regional courts as well, and the European Court, jurisprudence set by that court, and then also best practices around domestic legislation and domestic high courts as well. So there's a very large body of law from which we are taking our interpretations of best practice around press freedom. Now, there are as we see it, 3 core issues at stake that need to be considered when looking at press regulatory issues. The first one is that international law allows that freedom of expression may be subject to certain restrictions for the sake of other legitimate interests, and that includes, obviously, the protection of other rights. Secondly, that international freedom of expression standards do not prescribe anywhere a specific model for press regulation, so that is not defined by international human rights standards. And thirdly, that international standards demand that any regulation meet a strict 3-part test. And those 3 parts are that they should be prescribed by law, should be in pursuit of a legitimate aim, and it should be necessary in a democratic society. Thus, the restriction must be proportionate to the aim it is pursuing, and if there is a less intrusive option available, that should be the preferred option. Now, when considering these things, because we are, I know some in the room may wish otherwise, but we are a European country and we do have to adhere to the European Court of Human Rights. So the European Court of Human Rights has been very clear around some of these issues, stating that the states have a positive obligation to regulate the exercise of freedom of expression, but, and a quote from the court, they must not do so in a manner that unduly deters the media from fulfilling their role of altering the public, alerting the public to apparent or suspect misuse of public power. Thus, from those, from that position, we find or believe that self-regulation is the preferred model, but that co-regulation is also applicable and adheres to or does not violate international human rights standards, as long as that co-regulatory structure guarantees independence of the media and guarantees press freedoms. And also, very importantly, obviously, the independence of whatever regulatory body is actually established. So 4 points that we think are crucial when looking at press regulation would be independence from government, commercial, very importantly, commercial and special interests, established via a fully consultative and inclusive and transparent process that is democratic and transparent in the selection of members and its decision-making, and that is geared towards promoting and protecting press freedoms rather than focusing on imposing restrictions on the media. So looking specifically at the UK and looking specifically at, obviously, Leveson and the Royal Charter, first of all, I think it's worth just reflecting on what self-regulation or regulation actually seeks to pursue or ensure. And again, there are three main parts to this. Firstly, the protection of members of the journalistic profession. Secondly, to hold them accountable to their own profession. And thirdly, to hold the press outlets accountable to the public. So those are the three main parts that we're looking to ensure exist. There's also part of the discussion in the UK which is very much focused around the fact that there has been no regulation of the press in the UK for the past decades or historically. And this, of course, is something of a misinterpretation of what actually regulation means. There has been regulation of the press in the UK, and actually, in some cases, not very, certainly not in accordance with any kind of best practice. So looking specifically around issues of defamation or libel or official secrets and national security. So we shouldn't start, I think, the discussion from a premise that there's been no regulation of the press in the UK, but we are talking about looking at regulation specifically in relation to standards. So interpretations around Leveson and the Royal Charter. Well, I'm going to mingle, although they are two different processes, I'm going to mingle them into one just to save a little bit of time. So firstly, our overall comments around specifically actually the Royal Charter. One, in the information that we've put out, one, we've recognised that the PCC and self-regulatory structures to date have not been adequate and have to a large degree failed. Secondly, that when looking at regulation, there is no single one-size-fits-all model, and there are many different types of statutory regulation, co-regulation, self-regulation that are successful, but that they apply to the individual social, economic and cultural circumstances of the country in which they are in play. That we believe the Royal Charter establishes a system of co-regulation, and I'm going to come back to that in a little bit more depth in a second. And although the Royal Charter is a slightly arcane and outdated model, it is used in a UK context to try and achieve an independent form of co-regulation. So not maybe the best form of legislative processes, but under a UK context, certainly one that seems to fit the bill. So on the processes itself, we expressed serious concern about the lack of transparency around the negotiation of the Royal Charter, particularly in comparison to the Leveson process, which was a very positive process, a very engaging one, very broad and in-depth. We urged the government to engage more stakeholders and engage in a longer-term discussion around the Royal Charter and not to rush things through in the last stage, as it were, and actually asked for the Royal Charter to be postponed and for further dialogue to be had between different stakeholders, so obviously specifically the press, journalist bodies and the government, but also experts, academia, NGOs and others as well. So our main concerns around the Royal Charter and around Leveson as well are fivefold, really. So firstly, that any kind of regulator needs to have a very explicit press freedom promoting mandate, and that this should be stronger for any regulator. Secondly, that the Royal Charter introduces a model of minority representation by the press on the board. So rather than self-regulation, it's actually independent regulation, and that we would strongly advocate for a tripartite model of editors, owners, journalists and the public. Thirdly, that the standards code should be drafted not by the external bodies and by the public, but actually by the media community itself, and that should hopefully be in cooperation with, again, journalist unions and media outlets themselves to make sure there's strong buy-in to adherence to those standards. Thirdly, we have concerns around the group complaints or the allowance of group complaints rather than only persons directly affected by problems in the press. And thirdly, around rather ambiguous terminology around the regime of sanctions, and to remind any regulator that non-financial remedies should always be the preferred option. On the issue of whether there's a division, I would say that if there's I would say that generally there's not. I think different press freedom of expression organisations are driving towards the same interests of protecting a free and independent press and ensuring public interest journalism. I would say that if I think there's a difference, it's one between organisations such as ours, which take a human rights perspective and believe there's legitimate restrictions around freedom of expression that also apply to the press, and organisations which have a more specific mandate looking at press freedom and obviously want to defend that to the greatest degree possible. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thomas, thank you very much. Thank you for moving so quickly through such large issues. David, can I ask the same questions to you? I can repeat them if you want.
No, please don't.
Okay?
No need.
Good.
No need. And anyway, whether or not I touch upon them is almost a kind of matter of chance and happenstance, really. Hopefully, somehow or other I will. I have a disadvantage and an advantage. My disadvantage is that I wasn't actually chair of Index at the time when we were making the submissions to Leveson. Fortunately, somebody who was associated with Index at the time, who was deeply involved in it, is here and will correct me if I go wrong. Yeah, you will. So consequently, I wasn't involved in the detailed discussions about, as Leveson firstly came up with his proposals, and then as various people responded to it, and then as we got into the kind of late night hacked off and the government pizza at 2 a.m. in the morning stuff, I wasn't really there for that. I was actually in bed while other people were up. So I don't actually have as good a grasp, maybe as some people do, of some of the minutiae of what has been decided and what Leveson decided. That's my disadvantage, and my advantage is exactly the same thing. I don't, so I can attack this, if you like, at a slightly broader level of principle. Because, as I understand how Index came about its decision, which, and I'll describe what that is in a moment, it was a mixture of instinct and principle. Instinct and principle is derived from the purpose of the organisation itself, which some aspects of which you've just heard, but I just want to very briefly touch on what they are again. Index on Censorship was set up by various authors and playwrights and so on at the height of the Cold War to show solidarity with, essentially, and to agitate on behalf of people behind the Iron Curtain who were persecuted or imprisoned or prevented from saying what they wanted to say by regimes that wished to stop them. It's a very simple, straightforward birth. What it's developed into, essentially, is an organisation which internationally monitors and advocates in the areas of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, from the press to books to the arts and so on. And what it does is what Index does is it's not just looking at the threats to freedom of speech and expression, which are blatant, though we certainly do that, and not just those that are formal, though we certainly do that, but also those that are informal and creeping. To put it at its simplest, there is always somebody who is wanting to restrict somebody else's freedom of speech. It is absolutely extraordinary when you look at it from that point of view how absolutely consistent and constant this process is. And as we move into areas of new technology and new freedoms of expression, we find governments, and not just governments, but others as well, attempting to restrict what other people can say and essentially to penalise them for saying it. It's an ongoing process. So one of the things that Index has taken upon itself is to monitor how that is happening and to argue against it where we think that it is. And not surprisingly, therefore, we tend to, seeing what we do, we tend to set a higher bar when it comes to this question of the points at which you may curtail freedom of speech and expression on behalf of these other nebulous objectives which were talked about just now in the context of international law. In other words, international law is no real guide to us about how we look at possible curbs on freedom of expression, because there is always somebody arguing that their curb of freedom of expression is somehow within the law and within international law. It's just constant. You see it here and you see it there. So that's the basic level of principle. And that was the level of principle I understood that Index was operating on when it came to looking at the Leveson proposals. Now, I have another slight kind of problem, which is sometimes I tend to mix in what Index thinks with what I think, and they are distinct. I have another set of observations about Leveson, which are, if you like, kind of much bigger in terms of their kind of attitude towards what are the point of historical development we've reached with regard to freedom of expression, which largely says, in fact, the stage we have now got to with the capacity of people to communicate, I think the Leveson process was actually irrelevant by the time it even began, frankly. Sorry, I really wasn't fishing for that, but nevertheless I do. But let's assume, and we would have to assume, that actually it is completely relevant and that it has, whatever has emerged from it, has some kind of long, ongoing effect upon the way in which we look at freedom of speech. So what were the specific things that, when the board of Index got together to meet and discuss Leveson, being very much part, as they were, of the same, and let's be honest about this, the same kind of general milieu of such organisations, which you could very loosely describe as liberal guardianista, because that's essentially the sort of circumstances within which one people kind of, if on the radical right maybe containing the BBC, and on the far left maybe, Tribune or something like that, sort of, and everything running the gamut from A to B, as the old saying goes. But nevertheless, within a kind of milieu which, by and large, was not the milieu that reads, appreciates, or desires tabloid newspapers or tabloid journalism. Okay. If we look around this room, for example, we will see, by and large, a fairly homogeneous group of people. Homogeneous in attitude, to a certain extent homogeneous in background, maybe not in nationality, and so on. To a certain extent, if we're not careful, homogeneous in thinking, who have an imagination about journalism and about freedom of expression which is broadly similar, and a kind of, if you like, a hierarchy of approaches to them which is broadly similar. But we should be conscious that that is not all there is. There is very, very much more out there, and there are very many more forms of expression out there, and so on. So one of the things that has to guide a freedom of expression organisation is to admit that sometimes the expression you're seeking to defend is unpopular with you and with the sort of people who you mix with, and so on. It's not what you like, etc. This is quite an important guide to the notion of public interest, by the way, and the way in which some people would seek to limit public interest to, if you like, an almost kind of higher form of approach to what journalism and what content should be. Anyway, so that's a kind of background. But Index's principles, when it came to dealing with Leveson, were these. Firstly, politicians shouldn't ever regulate the press. Just shouldn't be involved. The press is bound by general laws like everybody else, in just the same kind of a way. People talk about Christopher Jeffreys quite a lot. It's quite interesting, but Christopher Jeffreys had redress through law. And incidentally, I will say one other thing about the Christopher Jeffreys case. Christopher Jeffreys had already been traduced by social media significantly, actually before a print edition of a newspaper actually appeared. It's not generally known, but I remember the date extremely well, and so on. And it is ironic to me to see people who are very big defenders of what you might call the statutory underpinning of the press, who I know were on social media on the day of the Christopher Jeffreys story broke, saying he looks a wrong 'un, using it as an example of why the press should be regulated. I mean, I don't say that is the rule, but I say it is an irony the situation we're in that lets those sort of things happen. So the press is bound by general laws. You can be done for all kinds of things as a journalist. That being merely the act of being a journalist doesn't stop you. Phone hacking is a fairly obvious example, made formally legal, but made illegal by the regulation of the Investigatory Powers Act of 2000, and from which, incidentally, there is not a public interest defence of any kind. Actually, we argue that there should be a public interest defence under some circumstances to the phone hacking. Why should phone hacking be different from any other form of gaining information if you believe that it is defendable on the grounds of public interest? But then, we don't believe, therefore, that government should be involved beyond what the law specifies in a statutory framework for the press. We think the press should be completely independent. Secondly, we believe that statutory underpinning is precisely what has now emerged from the government's discussions and so on. In the first instance, there are exemplary damages in the Crime and Courts Act for those who don't sign up to the Leveson compliance procedure. One of the things that Index has said, and that I think I saw as a journalist as well, is there will be, when such a case actually comes and is tested in the courts, it will end up in front of the ECHR. And I wouldn't like to bet at all that those seeking to get exemplary damages will win. I think they'll lose. Second, there's the Parliament lock on the Royal Charter itself. And although there's the talk about the two-thirds majority and so on, that somehow or other depoliticises it, you have to imagine the circumstances under which, let's say, there is a significant, maybe a whole series of terrorist acts and so on, and there is an enormous parliamentary reaction to that and so on, and you could quite easily get a situation whereby two-thirds of Parliament could actually, under those circumstances, be brought up to want to make changes and so on. It's not impossible to imagine it, and the question is whether we would actually want to envisage such a situation or regard it as necessary. So we don't like that and don't like the Royal Charter. We do like independent self-regulation as Index, although personally I can see some kind of difficulties and dangers as there, because frankly you could get the same kind of general mood notion of what is acceptable and what isn't through that process as you can anywhere else. And also I kind of wonder going forward whether in the era of constant personal publishing, which the internet now provides and social media now provides it, how relevant that will actually be to the way in which people live their lives. But nevertheless, it's a good idea to have high standards and to say that you want to have high standards and so on. But in the end, what governs high standards or not is going to be the preference of people to use those outlets that do have high standards, frankly. We all know it, it's what everything else depends upon, really. And if you imagine that it's something else, then I'm afraid that in that case what you're asking people to do, essentially, what you're doing, trying to do, is to undercut what other people choose to do. And that is, I think, something of a problem. However, what we would like to see a lot more action on, as we said, is public interest defences in other areas, including the Official Secrets Act and so on, because, unsurprisingly, being a freedom of expression organisation, we also tend to the idea of the greatest possible transparency in order to aid that situation. Now, should there have been, and it's a kind of slight implication, should there have been a situation in which we all got together and agreed in a sort of jolly way exactly what should happen? Well, I think that what Tom has very well laid out is actually that it's better if there's not, frankly. It was not a bad thing that we took a different view on this and so on. If there had been a consensus, it would have been formed by Index saying, this is not our view, we're going to go along with everybody else. I can't see that the world would have been in any way a better place for that happening. And I tend to believe, maybe it's sort of, it is a journalist thing, I tend to believe in cacophony and the contest of discussions, and feel that it was no bad thing. So we can have this discussion without any degree of acrimony, even if we come to different conclusions, and even if we're going to fight you to the death to try and make sure that our view prevails.
David, thank you very much indeed. Now, before we open this to you, let me just say two things. Firstly, I apologise on behalf of the Media Policy Project for the all-male panel here. This was not the plan, but our efforts to broaden that failed. Secondly, can I ask you please to say who you are when you want to speak, and I would ask you to address. I know that of course feelings and ideas are quite fierce on this matter. Please do address the speaker's points, the points of process, points of principle, as pithily as you can, so that we can move on with discussion. We do have to end by 5:02. So that having been said, please, would anyone like to start a discussion? Sir.
Sorry, sir, you have to speak into both microphones.
I speak with forked tongue. Neville Grant, Westcombe News. Broadly, absolutely support both the speakers in their stance. I just wanted to ask them what self-regulation must therefore entail some kind of sanctions. What sanctions would be imposed on people who break these rather vague rules that you've laid down, and how would those sanctions be enforced in law?
Thank you. Can I ask if anyone... it would be best, I think, if we take more than one. Okay, sir, at the back.
Hi, Chester Young from CY Film Productions. Yeah, I kind of have two questions, really. One thing is, why is it now we're facing regulations when, we know what's been happening all along, with the media, and, all this is brought about because of phone hacking, when right now our government is hacking us, spying on us, and why are they not regulated? And the other thing is, when it comes to freedom of expression and freedom of, the media, in terms of, people or journalists being able to express themselves and finding the outlets and platform to express themselves. In terms of regulating the media, is inclusion and financial support, or a way of bringing other voices into the mainstream media, a way of censoring people?
There was a hand down here.
Thank you. Jonathan Hayward from the Impress Project. David, I think you're completely right to say most people involved in Leveson, most people in this room don't read tabloid newspapers on a daily basis. I'm sure that's true. But I wonder what relevance it has. What is it about the Charter framework that means that any kind of tabloid journalism would be particularly prevented and, I think you're suggesting, unjustifiably prevented? Could you give some examples?
Okay, thank you. We'll take one more question. Please.
It's great to put your hand up when you've actually got the microphones in your hand at the time. One of the...
Sorry, you are?
Sorry, thank you. I'm Simon Kahn. My point is directed to one of David Aaronovich's comments. I've actually got quite a few I could take, but I'll just do one. One of the cheapest and I think weakest points that people make when attacking the Leveson proposals is to say that because of social media or just the internet in general, it's out of date before it even started. But I think if you look quite carefully at what most of Leveson was directed at, many, not all, but most of the evils were in fact the process of news gathering, not the publishing of information once the gathering has taken place. So that the internet doesn't affect news gathering. The internet just makes it easier for people who, like me, who don't have any news gathering powers, to express my opinions online. It's the process of news gathering that is fundamental to most of what Leveson was about. And I think if you look at it in that light, it's actually much harder to criticise what he came up with.
Thank you. I think we can take those now. There's a question about sanctions. What would they be? How should they be enforced? Tom, could you pick that up first?
Certainly. Well, there are there's sort of two aspects to that. One is assuming we have a regulator and it's recognised, that's an important step obviously, then the Royal Charter lays down the types of sanctions, including financial, that can be levied against a media outlet. But part of the comments that I made earlier was that also there's this rather ambiguous wording which doesn't define it that clearly, and that obviously by any regulator set up, which is recognised, needs to be clearly defined, and also looking very much towards non-financial sanctions rather than financial sanctions as the first option, as an absolute preference. Then I think David actually spoke about if a media does not join, it goes to the Crimes and Courts Bill, then there could be exemplary damages, although again the bill does state, I mean I have it in front of me, but it does state that this should be a last resort, other options should be explored. I would say that I think it's unlikely that the European Court, it could find, if the damages are excessive, it would find in favour of a claimant, but a European Court is not going to find against press regulation, co-regulation as such. So it may find against individual cases where they consider that to be excessive, but considering the wording of the law, the UK court's already instructed in that regard. So there's two different levels.
David, do you want to comment on that question about sanctions? What level of sanction should be envisaged under we sort of regulatory system?
As I understand it, we already have some extremely detailed proposals about what sanctions under either system would be imposed by the size of the potential size of fines. And so on, and the kind of areas that would be covered. And I mean, Index's position has been that it is entirely supportive of substantial sanctions and substantial redress in the context of complete self-regulation and so on. I mean, one of the reasons why this debate has been like it is has been the kind of perception that this wouldn't in fact actually happen in the end. If there wasn't some form of statutory underpinning and some kind of, which is one of the reasons why this business about about exemplary damages has come forward, because in practice the question is how it is you imagine that you would enforce people's compliance with or willingness to impose heavy sanctions. I just want to take up, since there are one or two of the other points, there's been a very interesting kind of subterranean discussion going on Twitter while we've been doing this. This is while I've been doing this. And it comes to the point that Jonathan raises with me. Jonathan, this is what you tweeted earlier. You said, "Dear Aaronovitch opens by disclaiming all responsibility for and understanding of Index censorship position on Leveson, #impressive." You would be done by my press regulator for so misstating my opening position in such a way, funnily enough. But it is kind of indicative of the way in which... And you then subsequently asked the question about what examples I had of the ways in which tabloids would lose out. That wasn't my point. My point was the psychological circumstances and background to which the discussion on Leveson in effect happened, and the way in which organisations, in a sense, because of the sorts of people who were involved and the way in which people were involved in the discussions, understood and perceived the problem. So if we... So,
let me ask the question quickly again. Why is that relevant to an analysis of Leveson or the new Charter?
Well, if it wasn't relevant, then in that case, hacked off, the major organisation has been wasting their time for the course of the last 2 years. And they obviously don't think they've been wasting their time for the last 2 years, because the entire business, and indeed the reason why hacked off as an organisation was in there with the government for the 2 a.m. pizza thing was precisely because this was a shared perception about what the scale of the problem was, actually. And I think we all know it. Now, you may argue that as a result that will have no impact on what regulation effectively happens, and that may very well be true. But I was talking about the arguments that were used to create a circumstance by which we now have government involvement or political involvement in regulation of the press. That was the underpinning of it. And that, in a sense, was the psychological circumstances, the social, cultural circumstances, which Index was facing in if you like, or in the organisations around it.
What are the examples of specifically tabloid journalism that you think would be unjustifiable?
No, I didn't. No, sorry, I have never.
It's not a relevant point.
No, it is a relevant point because we were asked about how organisations arrived at the position they did and the circumstances which they felt surrounded when they did, and I'm telling you what they were. It may not be relevant to your actual judgment, but it's certainly relevant to the arguments that were made for having statutory underpinning of the press. Of course they were. I mean, if you don't think the shroud waving of Hacked Off and the sort of, the kind of the Hugh Grantism and so on had any effect upon the process, then in that case, we're not living in the same world. It was absolutely crucial to it. Now, I can understand the Hacked Off position and so on, but nevertheless, it was a significant part of it. No, I don't believe that per se tabloids will lose out any more than anybody else as a consequence of it. I think that they were used as part of the argument for it. But we are opposed in principle to the statutory underpinning for the reasons that I've given.
I think that point's been addressed. Thank you, David. Can I just go pick up the second questioner at the back of the room? You asked whether inclusion, pardon me if I'm misunderstanding, if inclusion is a means of censoring media. Could you make the point once again, and then our speakers could...
In terms of having an alternative voice, because we know the mainstream media sometimes, as people believe, is owned by big corporations and people who got money and work closely with government. And there are times like me myself, I'm a documentary filmmaker and a journalist, and I have stories out there that I try to put out, but I feel it's constantly being blocked by mainstream media not to put my voice out there. And in terms of also getting funding to do certain projects like news reports or documentaries to highlight certain issues. And I felt really many doors are shut on me just because of the subject matter and coming from a different point of view. So is that not part of censorship as well?
So you would be hoping that a regulatory model would make it easier for you to have a presence. Can you speak to
no, I can. The point that you make is a very good point. It doesn't actually have anything to do with regulation per se, but it is actually interesting how often, in a sense, it's part of what is behind people's thinking about this and so on, which is that we have a problem with media plurality and so on. It's much less of a problem than it used to be in many ways, partially because, if you like, the kind of great corporations of the business, including the one I work for, wield significantly less power than they did, and that there are many more entry points for people as a result of new technology than once there were. Also, in the field that you're talking about, documentary filmmaking and so on, there's a slightly different set of organisations out there. I imagine that what you want to do is get on the BBC or Channel 4 or something like that, or be commissioned by them, and that's a sort of slightly different process. But if you look at it in a kind of bigger sense, the question about people's access to, let's say in some countries, even to the internet in order to be able to express the most basic opinions or to get the most basic levels of information is a very big issue. And in many ways it can be as big an issue as the question of direct censorship or chilling itself or attempts to interfere with press freedom or freedom of expression can be. I mean, put simply, if you don't have any access, you don't have any capacity to express that freedom of expression more widely. So I think your point is well made.
Thank you. Tom's going to respond, I think, on your first question about why now.
A good question. I think actually the LSE briefing there has a very good timeline in it of the very repetitive deja vu nature of this discussion over the last 50 years. So I'd recommend you to have a look at that. And it's certainly not a new discussion. In fact, when you read some of the statements that have been made and the different reviews that have been made of this over the last decades, it's very familiar reading. It's very familiar territory. Of course, why now specifically? Phone hacking, Willie Dowler, so on and so forth. It's come very much to the public fore. If there's something disappointing about that these issues are as much about police corruption, for instance, as it is about the media, which is less of the story and more focus has been placed on regulation as a discussion. What I would say is that, coming also back to your point around commercial interests, is that regulation, co-regulation, self-regulation is as much about media concentration of ownership and protection against other vested interests, including commercial interests, as it is about independence from the government. And that's a very important part of this discussion, which is often not looped back to. And it's an important part of the factor when you consider the different voices that are speaking on the topic.
Tom, thank you very much. Simon, I hope you don't mind. I think we'll take your remark as a comment rather than a question. And we have a question at the back. Two questions at the back.
Hi. Yeah, Evan Harris. I'm the Associate Director of Hacked Off, an organisation not represented on your panel, but which has been mentioned. And obviously, I don't have time, and it would be boring to reply to every error that's been made. But let me just take one example, out of respect for David, because I know he believes in evidence. Hugh Grant, 2 a.m. government pizza. Not one of those facts is correct. So all four of the facts that you cited, obviously you took your information from the press, okay, so I can understand where you got it from, but all four of those facts are incorrect. Who was represented in that meeting was Christopher Jeffries, okay, by us. And I'm happy to arrange a meeting for you with him so he can explain why his life was destroyed by 4 front pages distributed to everyone he knew in his life where he lived, and not by Twitter remarks, hurtful though they are. He'd also explain how, even though he was able to get a lawyer and eventually get some financial remedy, what he wants to see is it not happen, that contempt of court and obvious libel are prevented by proper self-regulation, because you could have if you convicted every murderer, it wouldn't be a better place particularly. You should try and prevent the crime to start with, and that's what the history of self-regulation has failed to do. But what I first wanted to indicate, this is my question, is around, because I respect David's, the nature and sort of style of David's approach here, it's helpful. And this is his view that politicians shouldn't regulate the press, they simply shouldn't be involved. 2 points. I've searched high and low on Index's archive for any criticism of the appointment by the press of Labour peer, then SDP peer, Lord McGregor, followed by Tory peer, former Cabinet Minister Lord Wakeham, to run their self-regulation, then Tory peer Baroness Buscombe. Then I thought, surely when they appoint another former Tory Cabinet Minister, Lord Hunt, and then he gets advised by a former Labour Cabinet Minister, Lord Smith, and another Tory peer, Lord Grade, all supervised by the guy in charge, a Tory peer, Lord Black, that Index would say this is unacceptable interference by politicians in self-regulation of the press. But there has been silence. And the Royal Charter, even if you could get a 2/3 majority to change it, because it's a voluntary system, if the Charter was changed in a way that restricted the press, the self-regulators, the independent self-regulators that were recognised, would de-recognise. And therefore, at the next 2-yearly audit, which is what it is, it's not a very fast way of controlling the press then, there would be no regulator. There would be therefore no incentives or penalties, and we'd be back to where we are. So not only is it difficult and slow and ineffective, it's counterproductive for the politicians to change the Royal Charter to restrict the press. It would not work. It would make matters worse as far as they're concerned. So I suggest that those people who argue that the Royal Charter is anything other than a protection from politicians haven't understood the way it works.
Thank you very much. We have also a question near you at the back, if it's related to that. And we have, following that, a question which I think will maybe the last. Well, we'll try and fit 2 in over here. As quick as you can, please, Damien.
Thanks. I want to ask about what you're going to do from here on in. We're going to see the announcement of a chair for IPSO. We're going to see the recogniser body being set up. And then there may be a process through which one or several self-regulatory bodies seeks recognition. I presume Article 19, we've seen that the value of a human rights approach to these debates are going to engage with that process. I'll be interested to know what you're going to be looking for, what you're going to be asking for, how you're going to engage. I'm not sure whether Index will be engaging. Maybe they'll be recusing themselves on the basis of their past position. but likewise for Index. How are you going to engage from here?
Got that. Thank you very much. There are two questions on this side, one at the back first.
Yeah, my name is Julie.
Sorry about this. Bear with us.
Even if I'm on broadcast, I don't want all the mics.
That's it.
Both? Yes. Oh, my goodness. Okay, that's fine. All right. Yeah, I'm a journalist, and most of the things that we speak about are very important, but I just wanted to focus a bit more on a subject which is very different. And this is state regulations of different countries of the media. I would just come back home here in the UK, talk about legislation like the Official Secret Act, talk about D-notices which are issued to editors by the government, especially during time of war and all. I was actually just thinking about your organizations and all this campaign or focus of freedom of expression. What policies do you have to deal with issues like this?
Thank you. We have time for a very quick 10-second question from the front, and then I'll ask you both for extremely rapid responses.
Martin Moore, Media Standards Trust. It's really a question to David. I'd be very grateful for a clarification of Index's position on IPSO, the regulator being set up by many of the news publishers, particularly in the light of what you said about it wasn't only governments that could constrain press freedom and freedom of speech, but also commercial enterprises. And certainly by my reading of the IPSO documents, the commercial enterprises and the major publishers have an absolute control of that regulator. And does that, do you think, from Index's perspective, represent a threat?
Thank you, Martin. Tom, you have about 30 seconds.
Right, okay. Onward engagement. Well, Article 19's position has been to comment on, but certainly not to endorse any particular actor or body that may be created. So our onward engagement would be to continue to express our concerns around some of the details. We will continue to push for a discussion around not actually the broader principles, but actually the details of what it is and what co-regulation, self-regulation should be aiming to achieve.
Thanks very much.
Okay. I did a whole programme with Christopher Jeffries, actually, and I talked to him. He wasn't aware of what had happened on Twitter before he even started, and he was surprised to discover it. There was a late-night meeting, and Hugh Grant is not a figment of my imagination, but more to the point, when it comes to the future behaviour of politicians and so on, well, frankly, I'd just rather not risk your good faith in their good sense in the future when it comes to press freedom. Sorry about that, but there it is. And no, I don't. It's not my opinion. No, I understand that, but nevertheless, it's a gamble on the future. It's a belief about what will happen in the future, and we just happen not to share it. When it comes to the, I'm afraid I don't have time to take up your point your points, which were very well made about other points of freedom and so on. I do actually have we want to see many more independent people on the press's own regulatory body and so on, and we want it to be tough. But I do actually have a worry about. I do have a worry in the way which is suggested about, if you like, a kind of normative process being established which chills out in the future different forms of expression. And frankly, this is not Index view, this is my view. Somehow or other, within the context of the law constraining us, we've all got to become a great deal more discriminating about how we react to what we see and what we read, because there is just so much of it, and so much of it is unconstrainable.
On that note, we really do have to end. Can you please thank our speakers?